William Van Wagenen, you are a writer focusing on Syria for the Libertarian Institute. You recently published an essay titled Creative Chaos: How US Planners Sparked the Anti-Government Protests of the So-Called Arab Spring in Syria. And to be honest with you, I'm not making a compliment. I find this essay very important in the literature of the Syrian war, especially when it comes to the narrative conflict between the narratives that happened in the past 11 years. And in my opinion, a lot of researchers were very biased in their research, and you tried to find some sort of a balance. And it was very comprehensive. I mean, you covered the era before the war started and how the US planners, the lobbyists, tried to ignite whether a regime change war, whether protests in Syria, something that we do not really discuss nowadays because we are at the end of the Syrian war and everyone is now concerned about the living conditions. But if we want to put this in the right track, we need to put the Syrian conflict in a proper context and how the war started and how it developed, what tools have been used, who intervened, why, what were their interests, right? So nowadays, the pundits, and I call them the so-called pundits, they do not really address the roots of the root of the conflict in Syria. But in my opinion, your article covered that comprehensively and impressively. So I congratulate you for the article. I myself learned a lot from it, and I'm very happy to have you on Syriana Analysis.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
William, you started with article by saying that the CIA did intervene massively in the conflict, in the Syrian conflict, by covertly pumping billions of dollars of weapons to Salafist armed groups, both directly and via allied regional intelligence agencies, in what is now acknowledged as the costliest covert program in the CIA's history. More importantly, there is clear evidence that US planners not only intervened in the Syrian conflict after it erupted, but they covertly sparked the conflict itself. Now, what is the evidence that brought consensus, let's say, to the discussion of the Syrian war, which indicates that this was the costliest covert program in the history of the CIA? And what is the evidence that the US covertly sparked the conflict in Syria?
Yeah, great question. So it's not controversial anymore that the CIA operation in Syria was one of the costliest ever. That's just based on reporting from the New York Times and from the Washington Post. Of course, that reporting didn't come out until roughly 2016. So in the early years of the war, that massive intervention was more obscured. And of course, opposition supporters tried to hide that or ignore it and claim that the US was not intervening in the war, or that the US even wanted the Syrian government to stay in power. And again, that was all a misdirection to hide the massive amounts of arms and weapons that the United States was pumping into the conflict. John Kerry also acknowledged privately to a group of activists that the US had pumped, large amounts of weapons into the country, to the Salafist militias and to Al-Qaeda, et cetera. But again, that's not controversial at all that the CIA did massively intervene. And so what I wanted to focus on in this article was the fact that it wasn't just that the CIA intervened after the war started, but really that they sparked the war, including through the anti-government protests that started in March 2011. Because that's an aspect of the war that is still controversial and is not often acknowledged, even by many people that are critical of the CIA's intervention or of Western intervention. Many of those people who would say it was wrong what the CIA did to support these Salafist militias, they still claim that the Syrian, the anti-government protests were grassroots, popular, and that the Syrian government used massive amounts of violence to suppress those, and that it was only the result of Syrian government oppression that eventually, Syrians took up arms and started an insurgency. So many people still blame the war on the Syrian government. Nicholas Van Dam, for example, the Dutch
The Dutch
ambassador,
ambassador.
he wrote a piece in Syria Comment, Dr. Landis's blog. I don't know, maybe it's been a year and a half now, but where he talked about how the Syrian opposition groups did commit war crimes, but he still concluded that it was the Syrian government that, quote, pulled the trigger, or that first pulled the trigger. And that's just not correct. So that's why I wanted to write the piece, is to counter that, that incorrect view of the war.
To be honest, I also blame the Syrian government in this at the beginning of the war, and I know this for a fact. The first day of the protest, I think it was on the 18th of March 2011, 7 security officers died in Daraa. And the Syrian government tried to cover up that because they didn't want to show the people that there is a serious armed violence happening in the country, and they didn't want to show that the state is weak, and they tried to cover up that. And they didn't document these incidents from the beginning. And the war in Syria is one of the most sophisticated hybrid and technological warfare as well. And the Syrian government was behind, like very weak in this regard. That's why a lot of, let's say, third parties, activists, journalists were more active on the ground and more successful in their job in this regard. So of course, if the CIA triggers a war, they will try to hide some of their tacit tactics, right? But when you have a government in Syria that is not able to trace these tactics and show them to the public, so a lot of people were also misled at the beginning. I know friends, I'm a Syrian at the end, and a lot of friends in Syria were misled at the beginning, and in a year or two they realized that something is very fishy going on. But these people, they discovered this by themselves in their own research. It's been not exposed by the Syrian government or their media outlets. Until this moment, it's very weak. I mean, imagine that we are in 2021 and Syria doesn't have an English program to talk to the outside world, right? So I really try to urge Syrians, to those who speak English, to be active more on social media, especially on Twitter. And the narrative, I mean, you can hide these tactics for a year or 2 or 3 or 4, but it's been 11 years. Everything is now on the table, and everything is now well observed and documented. I downloaded tens of videos starting from 2011 when the war erupted. I wanted to have an archive of the Syrian war, right? And I documented lots of violence in the first weeks and assassination of Syrian officers, Syrian military personnel. I mean, what kind of a peaceful protester can carry like a sniper and hit an officer from his neck from far away? These people were trained, right? So I tried to do, let's say, my part. And that's why I've been also targeted to smear campaigns. I've been called like I'm a propaganda warrior for Assad. But all what I really try to do is to show that there are two sides of this conflict, and it's been missing in the literature of the Syrian war. But if we go back to your article, you also mentioned the book Inheriting Syria for Flint Leverett, who published his book in 2005, and he was a former senior Middle East analyst at the CIA and senior director for Middle East Affairs at the National Security Council. Explained why US planners wished to effect regime change in Syria during this period. You detailed the reasons of the US for regime change in Syria. Would you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, so Flint Leverett, in that book that was published in 2005, he was really clear about why the U.S. Government wanted regime change in Damascus, and that was a long list of kind of historical grievances. Basically, the Syrian government was, resisting the American project in the Middle East, and so that included Syrian support for Hezbollah, transferring weapons, Iranian weapons to Hezbollah in Lebanon. It had to do with Syrian refusal to negotiate over the Golan Heights. It had to do with the Syrian government resisting the U.S. effort to invade Iraq in 2003 and successfully occupy the country. And it also had to do with Syrian support for Palestinian resistance groups, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the PFLP General Command, etc. So, as I mentioned in the article as well, those were many of the reasons that President Assad was, in fact, very popular with Syrians, and that was acknowledged by U.S. officials. Michael Ignatius in the Washington Post, he acknowledged that in an article that, look, Assad was very popular, and those were some of the reasons why, and those were the exact reasons why the U.S. wanted to overthrow him. So, of course, the U.S. Planners will always claim, oh, he's a dictator and he's oppressing his people and we want to help bring democracy, etc. But actually the reason they wanted to overthrow Assad was the exact reason that, the majority of Syrians seem to love him very much.
So they wanted to remove Assad for the sins he didn't commit, not the sins that he committed.
Well, it depends on your perspective from
a Syrian perspective. Yeah, from a Syrian perspective.
They were sins, but from not only the Syrian perspective, but just any decent human being's perspective, these were good things. That the Syrian government is supporting the Palestinian cause and resisting Israeli apartheid and colonization. Of course, those are things that should be applauded, but from, the U.S. point of view, that was a major sin.
Yeah, what really hurts the Syrians nowadays, if you ask them, is the position of Hamas at the beginning of the war and after the war. And Khaled Mish'al had a really special treatment in Syria, and his people he was like a friend with President Assad, right? Like they were family visits. And when the war erupted, they had to choose. Like, you have the Turkish and the Qatari, which is the Muslim Brotherhood line, and then you have the Syrian line, which is also aligned with Russia and Iran. They're partly still with Iran, but their major backers are also in Turkey and in Qatar. So, but it wasn't only that they withdrew from Syria, right? It's like there are some parties who says like, okay, I'm gonna be neutral, I'm gonna go. But no, Hamas was actively engaged. Like, I'm not saying all of them, of course, but some of the elements in them, especially the people of Khalid Mish'al and the people of Ismail Haniyeh, they even carried arms against the Syrian government, and they were allied with al-Nusra. And they had some, of course, fight against ISIS in Yarmouk camp. But what happened because of carrying weapons in Yarmouk camp is one of the biggest Palestinian camps in the Middle East, right? And it's not a camp. If you go there, it's a city. It's a well-established city. So by creating a war or confrontation with the Syrian government, this camp has turned into ruins now. And this is one of the dreams of Israel, right? To push away the Palestinians from the neighboring countries of Palestine, in order to finish the issue of the return for the Palestinians. And now a lot of these Palestinians came as refugees in Europe. So when a Palestinian arrives in Europe, this is just my humble opinion, it just takes 2-3 generations for them to be assimilated in these societies, and the Palestinian cause returns into some historical, let's say, issue for them, like something to be remembered, right? So it was a really bad decision by Hamas when they aligned themselves. This is just making my own comments in this regard. But if we go back again to your article, you said the US Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Paul Wolfowitz, told former NATO Supreme Military Commander Wesley Clark after the first Gulf War in 1991 that, I quote, "We didn't get rid of Saddam Hussein, and we should have. We have only got 5 or 10 years to clean up the Middle East. These old Soviet surrogate regimes like Syria and Iraq, get rid of them before the next superpower comes along to challenge us." My question here is not on the US plans to destabilize the Middle East, but rather on the attitude of Russia and China and their intelligence agencies in respect to Syria. I'm sure you agree with me that Moscow and Beijing have competent intelligence agencies. So the question is, what have Russia and China done to deter the regime change war in Syria before it's happening?
On that question, I haven't, that's not something I've researched closely, so I don't have a whole lot to share on that. I guess my only comment would be that, the Russians did go along with the Security Council resolution to approve a no-fly zone in Libya in 2011. And as probably most of your listeners know, the Russians felt kind of betrayed by that because quickly NATO and the US turned that no-fly zone into, bombing the capital and affecting regime change, and helping the Islamist militias that were armed by Qatar on the ground to take control of the country and to ride into Tripoli. So it seems like after that, the Russians kind of wised up or realized their mistake in Libya, and they were willing to provide more support to the Syrians. And again, I think there are more Russian interests in Syria than there were in Libya, so it might have even just been an issue of interest. But I apologize, I don't have any good explanation or a good sense for what the Russian intelligence or Chinese intelligence were doing in that period from, say, 2005 to 2011, when U.S. planners were making it clear that they had, regime change was in the works. But you probably would know more about that than me.
I mean, the intentions were there, right? Especially after the invasion of Iraq and the consistent statements and working to besiege Syria diplomatically and economically. But to put a regime change war plan into a practice like this war, what we have seen in Syria, one of the biggest wars, right? This needs years of planning. It's not like it started in 2011 and everybody decided that they want to join this war. So when the war started in early 2011 and the Russian officials were visiting Syria, the only thing they were hearing from the Syrian officials was, please tell us that you're not going to abandon Syria like you did in Libya. This was the only thing they heard from the Syrian officials, because in Syria they knew how big the war is going to be. They were not prepared for it efficiently because the type of the war was more guerrilla warfare, right? And the Syrian army has never trained for a guerrilla warfare. They were like a traditional army, and you have to ask yourself, if they knew something gonna hit Syria like this, what have they done for that? Because when it started, then they started to train paramilitary groups like the NDF to fight against the militants, because the army has no experience in fighting, and it's a big difference when you put like this is how Hezbollah won against Israel. They have different warfare tactics than Israel, that is a traditional army. 10 elements or 10 fighters from Hezbollah in 2006, they were able to defend an entire town in southern Lebanon, and the Israeli army was bombing the hell out of that town, right? And it as if they as if the Americans and the Israelis copied the tactics of the Hezbollah and Hamas and delivered them to the militants in Syria in a way that the Syrian army cannot counter. So Russians were hesitant also to intervene in Syria at the beginning. Or they said, yeah, we're with you politically, we will cover you. They used the veto several times. But in 2015, for Russia to intervene in Syria, it needed not only a request from Syria, official request from Syria, but also direct request from Iran. It was Qasem Soleimani who flew to Moscow and showed President Vladimir Putin the military plan to recapture the strategic, what back then in 2015 they used to call it the valuable Syria or the important Syria. They meant the strategic locations that they need to recapture in order to keep the country together. Not everything, but some important parts. It took lots of discussion for Russia to intervene. They didn't have, they weren't really motivated to intervene in Syria. But since they did, now you can see also Russia is having more, it boosted its status on international level. And Syrians know that. In Syria nowadays, Syrians know that they facilitated Russia's rise in the international scene. But at the same time, they're now more or less unhappy with the Russian attitude in Syria for two reasons. One is Russia is until this moment is advising Syria not to launch a military offensive on Idlib because they prefer a diplomatic approach with Erdogan, who hasn't implemented any of the agreements regarding Idlib, the buffer zone, reopening the M5 highway, and disarming the radical jihadists, etc. And the second thing is about Israel, the continuous bombing of Israel, and recently in the coastal side where the Russian forces are. I mean, Syrians are raising questions, and I have made a video about this, and I said, if the Russians want to continue their stay in Syria on a strategic level, because that's what I see that they're planning to do, they cannot do that without a popular acceptance. And it is there. I mean, at the beginnings, till 2018 and 19, it is there. And now the people ask, so what's the mission of Russia in Syria? If they don't let us liberate Idlib, and they don't let us liberate the eastern shores of the Euphrates, and they do not deter the Israeli attacks. So the sentiments are a little bit like critical against Russia, and it's very important for Russia to have a popular acceptance, because people, at the end of the day, you can make a deal with the government, but if you feel unwelcomed on the ground, that would be problematic for Russia on the long run. Now, it's a very important thing in your article. You mentioned that in 1996, David Wurmser, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the names or butchering their names, who served as Middle East advisor to former US Vice President Dick Cheney and as a special assistant to John Bolton at the State Department, wrote a policy document titled Coping with Crumbling States, a Western and Israeli balance of power strategy for the Levant. In this document, Wurmser argued that the US and Israel should, I quote, expedite the demise of Baasism in Syria and of secular Arab nationalism generally to create new states in the region based instead on tribal, clan, familial alliances. Do you share my observation that the strategy of the US and Israel has changed a bit in Syria from establishing an entity based on tribal, clan, familiar alliances to dividing the country into sectarian and ethnic bases? And do you believe the US-led Syrian Democratic Forces or the Kurdish separatists are leading this policy nowadays in Syria?
Yeah, great question. So I guess the important thing for both US and Israeli planners is simply to divide up Syria and Iraq along, basically to destroy any strong Ba'athist central governments that might have a strong army and divide the country up, whether it's by clan, family, tribe, or by religion, ethnicity, or sect. It's pretty much the same strategy. So Wormser uses words like clan and tribe and things like that, but then in the Yannan plan from 1982, I believe, a former official from the Foreign Ministry of Israel, Oded Yannan, he detailed how it was in Israel's interest to break Syria up into, an Alawi rump state, a Sunni rump state, a Druze rump state. So the bottom line is just to split both Syria and Iraq up into small, divided kind of mini states, just because that's they would just be weaker. I mean, Iraq, especially given their oil resources, if they have a strong central government and a strong army and an anti-Israeli stance, especially if allied with Syria and allied with Iran, for example, I mean, that's a disaster for Israel. So I think that's been kind of the strategy all along, and you see that in the lead up to the war, where U.S. planners were trying to promote Salafism, Wahhabism, given their deeply sectarian outlook of that type of extremist Islam, because it was just a way to make Syria fragment. And again, that's exactly what was already happening in Iraq in 2006. And U.S. planners at that time were openly talking about, hey, this is what we need also to do to Syria, is make the country divide up based on sectarian lines and through a sectarian war, just to divide it and to keep it weak. And I think that is definitely what's happening with the Kurds now, although that was, I think, the U.S. strategy a bit later, because as you mentioned, the Russian intervention in 2015 was decisive. The Russians have been a good ally to Syria, but it doesn't mean that they've always had Syria's back in every circumstance. They've had relations with Israel, relations with Turkey, so the Russians kind of have their own interests. But that being said, in the fall of 2015, I mean, it looked like Nusra coming from the north from Idlib, and ISIS coming from the east from Palmyra, and ISIS being in Yarmouk camp, that the Syrian government, or that Damascus, really was going to fall to the jihadists. And then the Russians, of course, stepped in and started their bombing campaign. And up until that point, the US had been using ISIS essentially as their proxy. And John Kerry acknowledged that in a recording to some serious activists that was leaked, where he basically said, look, we were waiting. A lot of people know this quote, but it's very important. Look, we were waiting, for ISIS to essentially threaten Damascus, and we thought we could manage that and use that as leverage to get Assad to step down.
The reason Russia came in is because ISIL was getting stronger. Daesh was threatening the possibility of going to Damascus and so forth. And that's why Russia came in, because they didn't want a Daesh government. And they supported Assad. And we know that this was growing. We were watching. We saw that Daesh was growing in strength, and we thought Assad was threatened. We thought, however, we could probably manage, that Assad might then negotiate. Instead of negotiating, now you got Putin to support him.
But once the Russians intervened, in my view, at that moment, U.S. planners realized that the effort to use jihadist proxies to topple the government was ultimately going to fail. With the help of the Russians, I think they realized pretty quickly that the Syrian government was going to defeat ISIS and Nusra and retake, territories in the east like Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa. And so at that point, the U.S. pivoted in their strategy. They kind of abandoned using ISIS as their main proxy and said, well, why don't we partner with the Kurds instead from the YPG? They basically out of thin air created the Syrian Democratic Forces. And at that point, the US said, look, we need to partner with the Kurds and try to capture as much of the Islamic State's or ISIS's territory as we can, before the Syrian army and the Russians are able to, because they knew that the Syrian army and the Russians were going to be able to. So it just created this race, where the Syrians and the Russians were coming from kind of more from the south, and then the Americans and the Kurds were coming from the north, and they basically kind of met each other at the Euphrates, and then that allowed the Americans to divide and carve up, or basically separate that large portion of Syria in the northeast with all the oil and the grain, etc. So now I think that's definitely the strategy to keep Syria weak and divided, is to support, or is to continue occupying northeast Syria with the help of the Kurds. And one thing that's interesting too is that, again, going back to that Yinon plan of the Israelis back in the 1980s that talked about breaking Syria up into these different, not only Syria, but breaking up Syria and Iraq into different sectarian mini states, is that I think supporting Kurdish independence was part of that plan. And we saw when later, I think it was in 2016, the Kurds in Iraq had a referendum to try to declare their independence. One of the few governments that was very, very supportive of that as soon as the Kurds in Iraq tried to announce their independence was the Israelis. It was the Israelis who were very, very supportive of that. And the Israelis have had a long presence in the Kurdish region of Iraq, going back to 1991, when the US established the no-fly zone there after the first Gulf War. The Israeli intelligence has had a strong presence in Kurdistan. So I do agree with you that, the Kurdish separatists, as I know you call them, that are collaborating with the United States, that's definitely part of the effort to keep, Syria and Iraq, weak and therefore not a threat to Israel.
Now, if we go a little bit back, before this regime change war erupted, during the preparation by the US planners, who used also, of course, Syrian collaborators, right? So part of the neoconservative effort to impose regime change in Syria was the creation of the Syria Reform Party, SRF, led by Farid Radri, shortly after the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Now, Radri enjoyed support from Richard Perle and other neoconservatives centered around then Vice President Dick Cheney's office. Radri viewed Iraqi exile Ahmad Shalabi's role in promoting the neoconservative planned US invasion of Iraq as a positive model. Radri even told the Wall Street Journal that, I quote, "Ahmad paved the way in Iraq for what we want to do in Syria," quote ended. In an indication of how deeply Radri reflected the interests of his neoconservative US sponsors and how little popularity he would ever enjoy among Syrians, Radri became a member of the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, the most powerful Israeli lobby in Washington, and he wrote a column on his website titled "Why I Admire Israel." Now, journalist Salim Abraham has detailed the plan of Radri and his backers to ignite a regime change war in Syria after the occupation of Iraq in 2003. Would you please tell us a little bit details of this plan?
Yeah, so again, for Washington, they always want collaborators that can put an Iraqi face on a US regime change attempt, or a Syrian face on it. And of course, we all know about Ahmed Chalabi. And again, Farid Khadri was just the Syrian version. They had an identical plan in both cases. But Khadri detailed in some essays that he wrote a basic strategy for how to bring down the Syrian government, which again depended on the fact that there were these sectarian divisions in the country that could potentially be exploited. And so his idea was to create a government in exile consisting of the different opposition groups that were already supported by the US, and then to somehow spark protests in the country, create unrest, and try to create a situation where the Syrian government would potentially overreact crack down harshly on the protests. And then that way, any violence against protesters could be portrayed as, the Alawite-led Syrian government oppressing Sunnis.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, hopefully a snowball effect would be created where the hostility between the different ethnic groups in Syria, again, would snowball just like they did in Iraq next door. And then that could then serve as the pretext for the US to create a no-fly zone, again, in the north, just like they had done in Iraq in 1991. And then potentially just for the US military to invade directly and take over the country as they did in Iraq. So that was the idea. Protests were a very, very important part of creating unrest that could lead to sectarian violence that could, provide a pretext for so the government would use violence to crack down, would create these sectarian divisions that would give the US a reason to be able to intervene and cite some humanitarian reasons like, oh, we have to go protect the Sunnis, et cetera, from the government. So that's, a lot of what we saw in 2011. And again, it wasn't necessarily Khadri's own ideas about this. These were neocon ideas that there was a CIA document from 1986 that I mentioned in the article as well that, lays out that exact same strategy. So it wasn't like Khadri's original ideas or anything. This was like kind of long understood to be the best playbook for destroying Syria from the CIA's perspective that went back, much further.
I don't underestimate the CIA's plans, let's say, regarding Syria or elsewhere, but it really amazes me how would they expect in 2003 people to go to protest against the Syrian government? On what basis? I mean, if I remember well, there were 2 times that the Syrian government had a genuine, very strong popularity. One was in 2003 after the war on Iraq and the position of Syria against the occupation of Iraq, and 2 in 2006 after the war in southern Lebanon. So the timing of it, for me, it seems strange. What were they expecting in 2003? On what basis were they trying to push the people to protest? I think it would have failed miserably in 2003 if they tried it. But in 2011, because of the Arab Spring and the general mood in the region, and a lot of people were enthusiastic of a change, and all these images coming from Tunisia and Egypt, the celebrations, the people of getting rid of the dictatorships, and they will create their own democracies, right? So of course, a lot of people were motivated, let's say, at the beginning. In March, May 2011, I was cautious, but at the same time, I didn't really, I wasn't sure that the protests were ignited by the CIA or elsewhere, because the mood was in favor of change. And I'm not saying that in favor of changing President Assad, but in favor of opening up the country a bit more, more of an economic reforms and more freedoms in political life and freedom of press, right? So me as a student of international relations and later as political science, I mean, it would be in my interest too, on a personal level, for Syria to be more open on a political and media levels. But it took me only 3 months to realize that what's happening, this has nothing to do with democratic demands, and especially after the massacre in Jisr in June 2011, when over 100 Syrian security and officers were slaughtered by knives, and it was like a big alarm back then. For those who want to take a step back and recalculate their whatever they believe, what's happening in Syria. I mean, do we want change? Yes, but do we want to murder? Who are these Syrian officers? I mean, my friends in the school, everyone serves in the Syrian army, right? Including my father, who served in the Syrian army. These are the Syrian people. Who are you killing if you slaughter? So when you see the rhetoric before and after slaughtering, you can see clearly there is no difference between Al-Qaeda and the people who were slaughtering the Syrian officers. So it's not a this rosy situation where you have this beautiful democratic option that you are not choosing. No, you have the Syrian government with its secular nature that gives cultural freedoms and religious freedoms to everyone. It has its shortcomings in terms of the political freedoms and press freedoms, but I'm not ready to destroy everything in Syria to have political freedoms, and that's what happened, unfortunately. So what have we really gained? Over 7 million people refugees now, a lot of people living in the refugee camps. Just compare that with the situation in 2011. I always ask these questions to my friends who are on the anti-Assad camp. Was it worth it? What you have done in Syria for yourself, for your family, for everyone? We're shattered now in all over the world, right? Including in Germany, and this is my prediction, and I think Germany will have one of the strongest anti-Syria lobbies soon, and its information in alliance with the Turkish lobby and the Qatari lobby and Muslim Brotherhood affiliates here. This place is gonna be, after the United Kingdom, the strongest Muslim Brotherhood nest in Europe. And I was shocked to know that in the 80s, when the Muslim Brotherhood revolted against the government, they had a press office here
Yeah.
in Germany. Sometimes I just feel like I'm living in a jungle of wolves here, and with all these journalists and experts who say, we are liberals, like, just try to dig in a bit. They all have connections with this Muslim Brotherhood activists, and they believe everything they say without questions. They publish everything they say, including notorious Muslim Brotherhood activists. I mean, I know a woman, she's very radical Muslim Brotherhood activist. She's a lawyer, and her father was in Talia al-Muqatili, in the fighting vanguards in Syria in the 80s. So they're presented as Syria experts, they're presented as experts on refugee affairs, etc., but they're forming a really strong lobby bloc here in Germany. Now, according to a December 2006 US State Department cable leaked by WikiLeaks, US Embassy officials in Damascus similarly suggested that the US should use sectarianism to destabilize the Syrian government, in this case by playing on Sunni fears of Iranian influence. Do you think this fear-mongering and pushing sectarian hatred against Iran has played a role in the rise of ISIS?
Yeah, I do. I mean, again, that was the strategy US planners wanted to push anti-Shia sectarianism. And so there was this concerted kind of propaganda campaign coming out of the Gulf that US planners supported. Al Jazeera played a big role in promoting the anti-Shia sectarianism, as did Salafist preachers like Muhammad Surur. He's someone who doesn't get a lot of attention, but he is a Syrian Salafist who had very vitriolic views against the Shia. The book that he wrote was cited by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi as, part of his motivation to call for the genocide of the Shia in Iraq. And this was the type of person, and those were the type of views that were being promoted by the Gulf to basically demonize Iran, make people think that Iran was supporting proselytization of Sunnis in Syria, trying to make them become Shia. And so that was a big part of the campaign and part of the propaganda once the protests did begin. A lot of the supporters of Surur were instrumental in the early protests in Deraa. And that's why you saw slogans from the very first protests like "No to Hezbollah" and "No to Iran."
We want people who are afraid of God. We don't want Shia. We don't want Hezbollah. We want people who are afraid of God. I remember this.
We want a president who is afraid of God, but really that means
Yeah,
We
and
want
they
Sunni and not Alawi president. Yeah.
they also said we don't want Shia and we don't want Hezbollah. We want King Abdullah. I remember this. This were in mid 2011. I mean, there was no Hezbollah or even an intervention back then in Syria.
So that type of sectarianism, obviously that's kind of what marked Nusra and ISIS, was that anti-Alawi and anti-Shia sectarianism. Of course, Salafism in general has that kind of sectarianism baked into it, and all of the early armed groups that formed the FSA, the Free Syrian Army, these weren't secular armed groups to begin with. All of them were Salafist groups, Liwa Tawhid and Suqur Sham, etc. So really, the earliest protests, of course, there were some people who, did want maybe more democracy, more political freedoms, freedom of speech, that attended the protests. It doesn't mean everybody was like this, but many of the organizers and a large segment of those who participated in the early protests were Salafists who had Salafist demands. And it just wasn't the secular, peaceful uprising that people imagined. Again, there were, but that promotion of sectarianism, eventually did, of course, lead to the rise of ISIS as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it was this hatred is a motivation. It's like a dynamo that makes the revolution continue. One is sectarian hatred, and two, blood. It's very important for people to know blood played a very important role. Like at the beginning, if there were any third party shooting on both sides, this was just because the culture there is based on revenge. And if you lose a brother, you're gonna kill 10 against it. So it just needed one person to die for all this snowball of bloody snowball to destroy half the country, unfortunately. But if I ask you again about Farid Ghadri, the Iraqi version of Ahmad Chalabi, he enjoyed good relations not only with neoconservative US planners, but also with the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood and its leader Ali al-Bayanouni, right? Who was seeking to foster better relations with Bush administration officials himself. The Muslim Brotherhood was seen as crucial to help steer trouble amongst the Sunnis of Syria. Although the Brotherhood had only an underground presence in Syria and membership in the group was punishable by death, Salim Abraham notes that, nevertheless, the Brotherhood is believed to be able to mobilize the already high religious sentiment in the country. What tools the Muslim Brotherhood used to mobilize the radicals in Syria, and has Qatar and Turkey helped this Islamist organization in terms of military, logistical, and media support?
Yeah, so the Brotherhood, of course, even though they didn't have a formal presence in Syria, they still had some supporters there. And so they were able to call on some of their supporters to come out and protest. In addition, one of the biggest activists who was, kind of portrayed in the West as a secular activist was Osama Monajid. And he was basically the head of the Movement for Justice and Development, or MJD. That was just basically a Muslim Brotherhood front group. So they received money from the State Department. Monajid had been to the White House and met George Bush and Condoleezza Rice personally. The State Department gave him money to start that television channel, Al-Barada TV. And then Monajid, he was the one who controlled, along with other Muslim Brotherhood activists, the Syria Revolution 2011 Facebook page. So, and then of course he had close ties with Al Jazeera. So any depiction of the conflict or the protests once they erupted that people like Monajid wanted to promote, they would be amplified further by Al Jazeera. And so they had a lot of media infrastructure in place, but Monajid and other activists like him were trained in nonviolent techniques of a US academic named Gene Sharp, as were some other kind of cyber activists. So basically, they had some supporters on the ground, not only Muslim Brotherhood supporters, but also supporters, again, of Mohammed Surur and the Salafi community in general in Syria. But also they had this whole media and social media network that they could call on to, again, call for people to protest and then disseminate what ended up being essentially fake news about how those protests unfolded, claiming that the Syrian government was just massacring peaceful protesters, when in fact there were Salafist militants infiltrating the early protests, firing on Syrian security forces and police, and creating all kinds of unrest. But again, as you mentioned earlier, the Syrian government kind of tried to hide it, that their soldiers and police were getting killed, as to try to make it seem like everything was still calm. And then through these videos posted to social media and then amplified on Al Jazeera and also on CNN, they could make it seem like the Syrian government was just massacring these peaceful protesters. And in many cases, it was the opposite. So in the article, you mentioned the massacre at Jisr al-Shugur in June was a major example of that, where over 100 Syrian security forces were murdered. But then opposition sources claimed that those people had actually been killed by their own colleagues in the army, because these members of the army were supposedly had refused to open fire on peaceful protesters. So that was a clear example from June. But in my article, I discussed the events from March 18th, 2011, the first major protest that did erupt, and there's indications that similar things happened there, that Salafist militants actually opened fire on Syrian police and security forces in Deraa on the very first day of the protests. But of course, that was depicted when several protesters were killed, that was depicted as the security forces coming in and just immediately opening fire and murdering these peaceful civilians. And that's just not how things happen. So all of this was, again, had been planned for a long time, and it was the Muslim Brotherhood that the U.S. planners were able to rely on. And again, Osama Munajjid was kind of the main figure to keep an eye on when it comes to all that activity.
I remember well into 2011, the first 3 months, Al Jazeera was day and night saying that all these deaths among the Syrian army officers, they are murdered by the security apparatus because they refuse to shoot the protesters. When you see, like, because they, like, if you see the images, it's pretty obvious some of them are not even killed by a bullet. They are literally decapitated, right? But it didn't hold up a lot. I mean, it's 3 months and nobody believed that narrative. And people can see underground these long bearded guys carrying guns and shooting on both the security. And so when the security or personnel were dying, who is killing them now? This time the army is killing the security. They were just trying to create this rift, but it was so unsuccessful. When you see how their language, straight face, if you can understand just one thing or two about media and just see the body language of the journalist, how he or she is formulating this sentence on Al Jazeera, you would know he or she is lying. But since we're talking about Al Jazeera, you mentioned in your article that the US partnership with Al Jazeera later became explicitly evident when a 2012 email from State Department planner Jared Cohen, by that time he was working at Google, to Hillary Clinton was leaked by WikiLeaks. What was this partnership about between Al Jazeera and the US?
Well, that email referred to a project that Google had done to basically create like an online tool to track defections from the Syrian government and military. And so it was Al Jazeera that actually claimed that they built the tool, but it had actually been built by Google through Jared Cohen, who formerly was of the State Department and who himself played a big role in planning for the regime change operation that erupted in 2011. So again, that was just another indication how closely the U.S. planners were working with Al Jazeera and all the propaganda that came out of Al Jazeera in support of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Syrian opposition in general, that, really they were operating, according to U.S. wishes.
This program that they developed, they were tracking the officers who were defecting from the Syrian government. How do they track? Like, how do they know this person is defecting from the government?
I'm not sure how.
But they're collecting data information.
It was, but it was like if they had this tool where they could supposedly track or keep track of people defecting from the government, and then Al Jazeera could use that in their broadcast to kind of promote the idea, hey, look how many defections are happening. Look how weak the government is. I mean, that was a big part of the propaganda too, was obviously claiming that all these people were defecting from the army. That was the myth behind the creation of the Free Syrian Army. There was the myth that supposedly all these members of the army were defecting. And in fact, again, all the earliest militias that formed the Free Syrian Army were Salafist militias. They had virtually no defectors. There are a few kind of public cases. But in general, even opposition sources like Azmi Bashara acknowledged that, look, none of these FSA groups are actually consist of defectors, That was just part of the propaganda. So it was a way to kind of falsely claim or promote the idea in the media that, look, all these people are defecting from the Syrian government and the army. But again, mass defections just never occurred. The people that did defect, soldiers and things like that, for the most part, they were defecting because they, didn't want to fight. They just wanted to escape the country and get out of the war. They didn't want to get killed in the fighting against the Salafist militias forming the Free Syrian Army. And but again, that was a big thing that the U.S. tried to do in the media, promote the idea that there were all these mass defections. And in fact, when you mentioned that Muslim Brotherhood office in 1982 in Berlin, they were doing radio broadcasts at that time claiming that, all these huge defections had taken place way back in 1982. And of course, it was just propaganda to try to make the government look weak and try to make people think, oh, we better abandon the government because everybody else is,
Amazing, really, the repetition of these techniques between the 80s and now. You mentioned the activist Razan Zaitouni in your article, whose case received international attention after her alleged abduction by Jaish al-Islam that allegedly murdered her, after years of accusing the Syrian government of abducting her, right? What could you tell us about Razan Zaitouni's activities before the regime change war and after, and her links to the US Embassy?
Yeah, so Razan Zaitouni was allegedly a human rights activist, and she was a lawyer. And she played a key role in basically promoting the US view of the conflict, making claims that the Syrian government was massacring peaceful protesters, claiming that the Syrian opposition and the protesters were all, fighting for democracy and that they were all peaceful. So she played a big role in the propaganda campaign. But before the war, again, she was a lawyer. She spent most of her time defending political prisoners who were themselves Salafists, or she was, the Syrian government, which I think was wrong of them to do, but they were imprisoning a lot of Salafists in the years previous to the war, obviously on suspicion of terrorism and things like that. And so that's how Razan Zaitouni made her name, was by defending these Salafist political prisoners, trying to get them released. But she had close contacts to the US Embassy as early as 2009. She was meeting with representatives of the US Embassy in Damascus and, sending reports back to them. She started a group called the Local Coordination Councils that became well known once the conflict erupted. But these weren't formed in response to the crisis in 2011. They were formed a few years in advance of it with US and French money. She created the LCCs, as they're known, along with another US-funded activist from France named Mazen Darwish. And so basically she was collaborating with the United States to try to overthrow the government.
And this was leaked by WikiLeaks, right? The WikiLeaks mentioned that she had contact with the American embassy in Damascus.
I believe so. I'd have to double check the reference, but 2009, it's clear that she was meeting with representatives from the embassy, and then also she met shortly after the crisis erupted in May 2011 with the U.S. ambassador to Syria, Robert Ford. He wrote about their kind of, clandestine meeting that they had. So again, she's always portrayed as a neutral, human rights activist that is just trying to protect human rights, but really she, was an agent of the U.S. And but it was, again, the propaganda regarding the Syrian war was so good that because it wasn't the U.S. government coming out and making this claim or that claim. They always had these surrogates or these proxy activists that could make claims for them. And so it seemed like the claims that people like Razan Zaytouna were making were, independent, neutral, just out of a basic concern for human rights. But really it was, a propaganda operation. And then even though she was a huge, obviously played a huge role in the opposition, she was, of course, once the conflict erupted, she was wanted by the Syrian government. And so she took refuge in Duma, which was under the control of Jaish al-Islam and Zahran al-Lush. And then, as you mentioned, as far as most people know right now, she and some of her colleagues were kidnapped and probably killed by Jaish al-Islam. And so it's kind of a tragic but also ironic situation that she spent her career, defending Salafist prisoners before 2011. And then after 2011 was doing, pro-opposition propaganda on behalf of these Salafist groups. And then, of course, took refuge with them when she was wanted by the government. And then it turns out they're the ones that kidnapped and killed her, as far as the best information indicates. So it's just another indication too that the opposition, even though it had this secular and democratic facade provided by people like Razan Zaytouna, at its core, what was driving it were the Salafist groups. They're the ones that had the weapons. They're the ones that had the influence on the ground. And they're the ones that organized even, many of the peaceful protests to begin with. So it just wasn't the case that it was a secular uprising that gradually became Islamized or got hijacked by extremists. This is what the so-called uprising was from the beginning, was dominated by these Salafist groups, again, especially by supporters of Muhammad Surur and other Salafist, preachers from the Gulf, the Muslim Brotherhood, etc.
So we discussed all these plans by the US lobbyists and planners against Syria who put this infrastructure for a regime change war in Syria in place, and there were collaborators from the Syrian side, combination of some Salafists, Muslim Brotherhood, and some activists pretending to be human rights activists. And it was a huge propaganda campaign. Some people fell in it. Some people were more awake. Like this war has woken them up on the reality, and especially when they learned from the lessons in Iraq and Libya and other neighboring countries. So I want to end up this conversation with you with just maybe you want to tell me how do you think the conflict will develop nowadays? Do you see any political settlement for the Syrian crisis, or there's going to be another military conflict in Idlib or in the eastern shores of the Euphrates?
The things that worry me, I guess, is that, again, going back to some of the ideas of David Wormser about dividing Syria and keeping it weak and along sectarian or ethnic lines, I kind of feel like that's the situation right now with HTS or Nusra controlling Idlib along with the Turkish military, and then the US and the SDF controlling the northeast. You know, the country is divided in that way, and of course the sanctions are in place. So I worry that now that the country is largely divided, that it's going to be pretty easy for the US to just kind of maintain the status quo, the US and Turkey to maintain the status quo. I don't think it's going to take too much for the US to continue the occupation of the Northeast along with the Kurds, unless you know, their position changes for some reason. So I don't know. I just kind of worry that the current situation will continue kind of indefinitely, just like say in Iraq in '91 when the Kurdish areas were essentially broken off with the US no-fly zone, and then the US had sanctions from '91 to 2003 on Iraq that led to hundreds of thousands of deaths of kids and women. And the US was able to kind of maintain that situation for, you know, for a long time. So I just kind of worry that the status quo will continue. But again, I don't know if I have any great insights about the current situation, since I have not been studying that nearly as close as the early days of the war. So
I totally agree with you on this, because the current situation indicates that the Americans want to keep Syria the way it is. They know the regime change war has failed, but it didn't also, Syrians also didn't succeed in defeating the American plan entirely. And they can keep Syria weak, like the way it is right now, through sanctions and through depriving Syria of its natural resources. However, and this is like the attitude in Damascus, I would say, and if you ask sources in Syria, you have this over self-confidence about restoring the occupied areas. And they are confident that they're going to play on the element of the time, on the time factor, and the circumstances will change eventually. They're now trying to have some good relations with the Emiratis and the Saudis, and that may counter the occupation of the Turks in north and in Idlib. But in the east, it is just up to the Russians and the Americans. East Euphrates is where the final, let's say, stage of the war will be settled. And Damascus is not going to accept federalism, for sure, 100%, and the Kurds are not going to accept less than that. The separatists from the Kurds, let's say. So it's a really difficult situation. If the Russians weigh in there, if the Americans try to withdraw, because there are some signals coming from the United States that this could happen after the elections, the upcoming elections in the US. They don't have a long-term plan to stay there, but they can empower the proxies. But even with that, the Russians will come and take over the oil fields and try to invest there, and they will try to find a solution between the Syrian government and the Kurds. So let's see. We don't want to make big predictions, but let's hope that Syria would come back to its unity again, because that was the time that I personally lived in a strong and very beautiful Syria, where we had a very good life there, and I wish the same for all the Syrians and for the upcoming generation. Right, so I'm very happy to have you, William, on my show. You are a writer and a researcher focusing on Syria, and it was a really pleasure to discuss all these details with you. I think this is one of the most comprehensive discussions that I ever had about the phase before the eruption of the war and during the war, and I'm sure the followers of Syrian analysis appreciate your insights.
okay, well, appreciate it. It's been very nice to chat with you, and hopefully we can do it again.
Thank you very much, William. And guys, if you're new, please consider subscribing. It's really important. Also, like the video. It helps me with the algorithm of YouTube, especially with shadow banning. And if you want to support my independent commentary work like this, you can become a patron. Link in the description below, and see you next time.